if you're paying attention, you dodged a bullet. The hymn that's in the order of service was crazy hard. For the earth forever turning reminds us that we are earthlings. As Thich Nhat Hanh said, the real miracle is to walk on the earth, not to walk on water. I guarantee you that this might be one of the only churches in Dallas that's celebrating Earth Day. And that's okay, that's good. We are paradigm shifters. We don't have to play by the typical church rules. So if you're a visitor, welcome. So let's get the cliches out of the way. That earth is our mother, to think globally and act locally, to try to leave the earth better than when we arrived, to call the earth something more than earth, maybe call it ocean. So many things to say on Earth Day. Take care of it, recycle, preserve water. We've done it all, we've said it all on Earth Day in church. And there's plenty of bad news to point to, which we have pointed to many times also. Climate change deniers in the highest offices of power, reversals of laws protecting waterways and sanctuaries and public lands, wars that ravage landscapes, the industrialization of our food sources, the genetic tampering of our crops, the bleaching of coral reefs, the extinction of animals like the Christmas Island pipistrelle bat and the South Asian fisher cat, which went extinct last year. All bad news, not to mention that Al Gore has gone pretty quiet. I don't know what he's doing. Plenty to worry about. But we have preservationists and environmentalists in our world, and especially in our church, who have done that hard work, but also pointed beyond these moments. People like Ned and Jeannie Fritz who founded the Texas Conservation Alliance and the Texas Land Conservancy, most famous of all our members. They received awards and recognitions at the national level on behalf of the environment in Texas. At the end of his life, Ned would say to me often, "It's all about overpopulation," he said. We know it's partially true. Partially, it is a partner to resource allocation. All the same, what Ned was saying was that the environment bends under the weight of our human presence. Many here in our church, like Campbell Reed and Gwen and Alan Loomis and David Gray and others, have worked hard on issues around clean air and forest preservation and recycling. The work continues. The problems never seem to cease. And we have been in the center of so much of Dallas's environmental work. To find role models in conservation isn't hard around here. But I've been studying one man's life, a man named John Muir. He is considered by many to be the father of conservationism, an enemy to those who wanted to exploit the natural world for gain, something we should pay attention to today. But John Muir led not only with activism, but with a spiritual demeanor. He lived in the generation that followed Henry David Thoreau, our own transcendentalist. And Muir said things like this. He said, "We who are called to the pure and deep communion of the beautiful, all-loving nature must find a way to understand it and be in its presence and know its value." Born into a Scottish immigrant family, he grew up a boy on a farm in Wisconsin. In 1867, he took a job in a factory as a 29-year-old man. He created inventions at this carriage parts factory, and in an accident with a machine file, he had a piece of metal go through the cornea of one of his eyes. At that time, the treatment was for him to cover it and sit in the dark for 4 weeks. Fearing he had lost his eye, he spent that time dreaming of seeing majestic things. especially the falls in California he had once seen a picture of, the Sierra Nevadas. His eye did heal, and he decided to change his life. He called himself a tramp and drifted across the Americas. He went south to Florida and then across to San Francisco, arriving there in 1868. He said the mountains called him, and he called the Sierra Nevadas the range of light. He considered nature to be his church, Yosemite Valley to be his cathedral. He described being there and being reborn, he used that word, because of the land. He lived for 4 years among the trees and in the woods. He said, no temple made with hands compare to Yosemite. Every rock there seems to glow with life, he wrote. At one moment, aware of the beauty and the majestic nature that surrounded him and oblivious of all the things that were happening in the world at the time. In 1871, he published a work on the natural wonder of Yosemite in the New Yorker magazine. And by 1880, he was married to a woman named Louisa Strenzel, whose father owned fruit trees in an orchard in Martinez, California. And he and his wife, he called Louie, started to build a life, and he tended the orchards of her father and lived in their home. Now, what came first, his yearning to be in nature or his working for his father-in-law, I am not sure, but his wife called what he had low altitude sickness. And she ordered him to go into the mountains, to leave the work to her. She took over the orchard and commanded him to go back into Yosemite. This is where Muir's philosophical and spiritual commitments to the earth were forged. He retreated into the wilderness, and he wrote on being alone, I expect to be entirely alone in these mountain walks, and notwithstanding the glorious portion of daily bread which my soul will receive in these fields where only the footprints of God are seen, the gloom will be lonely, but I will cheerfully pay the price of friendship and all besides, to be in nature. At that time, Muir's ecstasy was being interrupted by logging companies chopping down trees in Yosemite and business interests in redirecting the Nevada Falls and San Francisco city government wanting to create water sources for the city. Muir noticed at the moment that his sanctuary was in danger. He would write spiritual tracts about his experiences, like this one where he stood beneath the falls and wrote, in the solid shafted body of the falls is a vast number of passing caves, black and deep, with the close white convolving spray for sills and shooting comet shoots above and down their sides like lime crystals in a cave. And every atom of the magnificent being, from the thin silvery crest that does not dim the stars to the inner arrowy hardened shafts that strike onward like thunderbolts in sound and energy, all is life and spirit. Every bolt and spray feels the hand of God. Oh, the music that is blessing me now, he writes. The sun of last week is given the grandest notes of all the yearly anthem, and they echo in every fiber in me. Poetic, spiritual reflections of being in the world. He called for the preservation of these places. He demanded that we not cut down all the trees for the homes of San Francisco. He said any fool can destroy trees because they can't run away. He said God has cared for the redwoods, saved them from floods and fire, but can't save them from fools. Yosemite National Park was created in 1906 to protect hundreds of acres of redwoods, and majesty of that place, the water sources. Muir toured President Roosevelt through Yosemite, impressing him with the wonders he showed, and then fought battles not to flood the Hetch Hetchy Valley, which he lost. And he lost friends over his activism, but he did it with the spirit of being fed by the natural world. He did all this work to preserve nature because he knew that nature wasn't just there for us to objectify, it was there to help our spirits. Muir died on Christmas Eve in 1914, and in 1916, Congress created the National Park Service. 83 million acres of nature were protected, much done pointing at the grave of John Muir. Here it might be said in this sermon that we should appreciate the fact that one person can change the world, which is true, but for today on Earth Day, I'd rather say that it is a fact that the world can change a person. Muir founded the Sierra Club. He was its first president. He pointed out that glaciers, not earthquakes, form the Yosemite Valley. But more than that, I think his story speaks not only to the salvific work he did for the earth, but the earth's salvific work it did on him. He reminded many of earth's sacredness, encouraged engagement with it, activism even, but he also encouraged awe and wonder, a deep connection to God's creation above all else. Any one of us who spent time in forests know its calming effects, its healing that happens, and researchers now are saying that forest environments promote lower concentrations of cortisol, lower pulse rates, lower blood pressure, greater nerve activity that heals the body. The Japanese hold what they are calling forest bathing activities. Some pictures that you saw earlier were pictures of people going into the forest just to receive what the forest can give. Nature may have healed you, it has certainly healed me. My mountaintop call in Nepal changed my life. I went into the wilderness, receptive to hear a life redirecting message, return home and serve your people, which I heard in my ear. In the midst of the majesty of 14,000, 21,000 foot peaks, had I not had that experience, I would not be here in this pulpit with you. I have often felt the urge to clear my spirit by a walk in the woods or in nature. When I was a chaplain at San Francisco General Hospital in the ward where AIDS was ravaging young men, where death was an everyday occurrence, each weekend I would go to Point Reyes onto the National Seashore and be renewed and restored to be able to give presence to the dying and to the living in that hospital. One of the most spiritual experiences I have ever had was walking with my family in the northernmost California redwoods and standing next to a tree that sprouted in the 1500s, feeling the stretch of time next to one of the oldest things living on the planet. The message today on Earth Day for me is not that we must save the earth, but that earth must save us. That nature is God's gift, the healing we need, only approximated in our gardens and urban landscapes, but a holy and necessary presence. Nature saves us, and it saves us in its gift to the Spirit, sometimes in calling us back to who we are, and calling us into a deeper reflection of who we are, and helping us live the lives we want to live. I want to close with the story of a person who nature called into living a life that she wanted to live. It's a story about a young woman named Frances Flint, who was born in 1907 in a wealthy family in Boston. As a child, Frances developed a fascination with the natural world. She wanted to grow a garden, so she went to her mother and said, "I'd like to grow a garden out in the back of the house." Her mother said, "The staff will dig the garden and you can pick the flowers when they're done. Don't get your hands dirty. If you do, wear gloves," she said. It was that kind of life. But Frances loved dirt and collected frogs and put them in kitchen pitchers and held wild pets in the back garden. She kept her family from uncovering the evidence of her wildlife adventures. She created a secret garden in the back, planted poison ivy around it to keep the people out. She was immune to it. As a child, her caretaker took her to the Natural History Museum before a visit to the dentist. And when they had to leave the museum, she cried and wouldn't leave. And her caretaker said, "I'll bring you back here next time we go to the dentist." So that night, she poked her gums with pencils until they were so swollen that they had to take her back to the dentist the next day. She dreamed of going to Africa and seeing the animals that she saw at the museum. She grew up. She flunked out of Smith College, and in 1931, she met a man named Frederick Hammerstrom at a dance. He told her he wanted to be a naturalist and study animals in Africa. They fell in love immediately. The Hammerstroms went to Iowa State University. They went to Wisconsin to work at a wildlife refuge. They attended graduate school under Aldo Leopold, the father of game management. Frances was the only woman graduate student ever to get a master's degree under Leopold. Leopold started the Hammerstroms on a study of the imperiled greater prairie chicken, an endangered species in Wisconsin. She would get letters from home reminding her how to set the table and asking if she needed more spoons or dessert spoons for the table she was setting. Meanwhile, she was burning dresses to keep warm and eating standing up next to the wood stove in their prairie home. She became a prolific writer and wrote hundreds of professional papers and 10 books on the prairie chicken, on eagles and harriers and other wildlife. And she and Frederick took in students for over 21 years to study the prairie chicken. And dozens of students reported they watched Fred and Frances, one with each other and one with the natural world. They had 2 prairie-born children. And Frances and Fred figured out that the prairie chicken died off slowly, not because of hunting, but because the prairie chicken needed the prairie. And when the prairie went away, so did the prairie chicken. They realized how the prairie system itself, the system of bugs and grasses and seasons, held the chicken in its habitat, like nature holds us. And then Fred was diagnosed with cancer and died in 1990. After Fred died, Frances finally went to see the places that she wanted to see all her life. She went to Saudi Arabia and Africa and South America. On an expedition in Peru at age 86, Hammerstrom broke her hip and was evacuated by helicopter. She returned the next year. Along the Amazon River, she wrote she would listen to the birds. At night, they would sing, and she would think of her husband. In the 59 years they had together under the stars, in the cold land, among the wildlife, sometimes listening to the birds sing on the prairie in Wisconsin. She remembered how the urge from nature saved her from the life she didn't want to live. Frances Hammerstrom died in Port Edwards, Wisconsin in 1998. nature, the natural world, the natural earth that we take for granted, reminds us of who we are, better than anything or anyone will ever do. And so, some cliches for the day. Earth is our mother. Think globally and act locally. Try to leave the earth better than when you arrived. Take care of it, recycle, preserve water, and remember, we who are called to the pure and deep communion of the beautiful, all-loving nature must find ways to understand it and be in its presence and know its value. A good Earth Day to you today. May it remind you to look around at the miracles that exist and the nourishment that's given to us and ask nothing back. May it remind you of who you are today and every day. Amen.